I'm not much of a public speaker. I spend most of my time sitting in a basement over a drawing board by myself for hours at a time, so you'll have to excuse me if I'm a little nervous. But they say you're supposed to picture the audience in their underwear, which I don't know if that's really a good idea because my parents are sitting right there, so I'm going to skip that. Anyways, I guess what I'm going to talk about tonight is sort of how a kid who grew up in Woodsley ends up writing for DC Comics. And the funny thing is, the way I got there was writing comics about a kid growing up in Woodsley, reading DC Comics. It's kind of been a long and sometimes hard road, but hopefully I can sort of shed some light on the process and on how the area itself, the county, has informed my work and sort of helped me develop my own style of storytelling. And I guess we try to figure out where to start with this, and really it all starts at Saddler's grocery store in Essex, which I don't know if it's still there or not, but for whatever reason, right from the beginning, I was just drawn to comic books, and I'd just read anything I could get my hands on, and I'd just spend hours at a time, sitting in my room reading them. And the funny thing is, for whatever reason, the superheroes I always loved were always DC superheroes like Superman and Batman. But it wasn't just reading comics that really captured my attention. I think part of it was it became right away it became an interactive thing with me, where I was also drawing comics right away. I mean, as with most kids who start drawing, most of my early stuff would just be sitting there and copying pictures from my favorite artists, and mostly just superheroes and things like that. And I don't know, at some point it stopped becoming me just copying drawings, and I started to realize that these drawings were actually done by real people and not just by some machine somewhere. And once you realize they're done by real people, you start to think that maybe one day you could do that. But as I said, you realize most of these artists and publishers are all from New York City, and when you're a kid in Woodsley, New York City might as well be Mars because it's just so far away. And I never really thought I could have much of a career drawing comics or doing comics. So for me, it was always just a fun thing. And at some point, it stopped being me just copying other people's work and me, creating my own stories and my own characters. And I think when it was time to go to university, the idea of getting out of Essex County and going to the big city of Toronto was really exciting to me because I never really connected much to the farm or to that sort of lifestyle as a kid. So I went to film school at Ryerson in Toronto. And I think probably a lot of the reasons that brought me there was the idea of still telling stories and using images to tell stories. And for me, film was a way I thought of doing that and maybe working in that industry and making a career as well. And I think it was my time there I really stopped reading comics actually for a few years and just got really into movies and other types of storytelling. And but sometime around the third or fourth year in the program doing film, I just became really disillusioned because I would have ideas in my head of things I wanted to say or stories I wanted to tell, but trying to communicate that through actors and through a crew and through trying to get a budget, because film was very expensive as well. And by the time something came out on the screen, it was so different from what I pictured in my head that it was inevitably just disappointing, and I became kind of disillusioned with the idea of pursuing film. And I think I stumbled into a couple of comic shops in Toronto, and I sort of stumbled upon a lot of the independent and underground comics that were coming out from the States at the time. And for me, that was I grew up reading the superhero stuff and everything, which I still love, but it's when I started to see some of the things that were being done with graphic novels and with comics, it just really opened my eyes to the possibilities that this medium can offer. Really, when you can combine words and drawings on a page to tell a story, it's pretty limitless in what you can do as long as you have the imagination to carry through an idea. And that really changed my perspective on comics and on maybe that was a way I could tell these stories I wanted to tell, because to me it just seemed so much more direct. I could just sit down at a desk and draw something and it would just come directly out of me, and I didn't have to worry about filtering it through other people. And it just seemed there wasn't a lot of, I guess, other than writing novels, there really isn't much more. There isn't a more immediate art form that I could think of to tell my stories. And as soon as I graduated from film school, I just pretty much had enough of that. And I got jobs working in kitchens around Toronto at night, and I just started drawing all day. And I did that that was probably 99 or 2000. I started doing that, and I would spend 6 or 8 hours a day drawing, and then I'd go work in a kitchen all night and just keep doing it. And I probably produced, I don't know, thousands of pages of comics in that 5-year period that were just completely terrible and weren't worth reading. But each time I did a new page, I learned a little bit more, and I got a little bit better at it. And I guess there must have been some spark of something in there that kept me going each day. And gradually over time, I think I got better and better, and I started to see a lot of, self-publishing as a real option with comics, where you can just, go to Kinko's and photocopy your drawings and staple them together and sort of sell them around at little local shops or record stores and things. So I just started doing that, and probably much to my parents' dismay, that didn't really have a lot of promise for making a career for myself, but I did it anyway because it's what I love doing, and did that for a couple of years. And then I was lucky enough to win, as Dale said, a Zurich grant, which is a grant offered by, funny enough, it's one of the guys who created the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. He offers this grant, 5 of these grants every year, to up-and-coming comic book self-publishers. I applied for that, I think, 3 years in a row before I got it finally, for a book called Lost Dogs, which Dale talked about, which was really the first long-form work that I did that was, I thought, worth maybe putting out there into the world. So I got this grant, and through that I was able to distribute the book, across North America. It didn't change my life financially in any way. I think I only sold about 600 copies over 2 years or something, but at any rate, it was enough to at least have something published to show publishers, and that was a big step for me. And after I finished Lost Dogs, I sort of floundered in terms of trying to look for what kind of stories I wanted to tell and what I wanted to write about and draw about. And I think I probably started and stopped a few projects in that time. It just didn't really go anywhere. I didn't really appreciate Essex County or the landscape or anything when I was here, but the distance that I had after living in Toronto for, I guess at that point, 6 or 8 years, and sort of that perspective that time and distance can give you on a place, I really started to see the landscape of Essex County as a really beautiful thing. Just all the open spaces and the worn old farm equipment and the old silos and windmills along the road, and these things just started to fill up in my sketchbooks, and it just became sort of an obsession of mine again to start drawing and writing about where I came from. And I guess I have I'll start some slides as well. I brought a few slides of some of the stuff I was sort of drawing at the time, and some real places around Essex County that sort of started to pop up into my sketchbooks. And this is the co-op near Bell River where my parents used to take the beans, and it became one of the central sort of little locations I started drawing a lot. And it's of course Jim's Esso, which is right near our house, and what else? It's my dad's few public posts there. When I was trying to decide how to structure the first graphic novel, Tales from the Farm, the thought of the farm, it seemed like the seasons on the farm was such a great way to structure a story, and the story of these people I was writing about. So, spring, summer, fall, and winter became sort of the 4 chapters of the book, and the best way for me to show that visually was just these 4 shots of my dad's field, and of course starting with bare and winter, and then this was spring, and then of course summer and winter, you can imagine. But this was, I think, an image similar to this was really where the story started, the Essex County books. It was just the idea of this kid living on a farm who dressed up like a superhero and loved reading comic books, and I don't know where that came from, but I think I knew somebody like that once. It was the idea of him hanging around with this big, rough ex-hockey player. That's where it all started. And I finished the first book and submitted it to a few publishers in the States, and I think I heard back from 2 of the 3, and one of them wanted to publish it, which was Top Shelf, a company that puts out, they're a small publisher, but they put out some really, really high quality material, and it was they don't sell a lot of books, but the ones they do sell tend to carry a lot of prestige in the industry, and when they wanted to carry the book, that was a big step for me, and I obviously got really excited. And while I was working on the first book, I think somehow the story started getting bigger and bigger, and I imagined new characters and new stories sort of springing out from this one. And before I knew it, I was proposing that I do a trilogy of books set in Essex County, Ontario, to a publisher in Atlanta, Georgia. And somehow they said yes. So, of course, the next book was Ghost Stories, which also combined my love of hockey with my love of comic books and the farm. And then Country Nurse, which came out last fall, I believe. And so somehow this little story about a kid sort of like me growing up on the farm became this multi-generational saga of one family over the course of, I think, 70 years. And it started to deal with loss and guilt and memory and imagination. And most importantly, it just was about family. And I finished the Essex County books, and the first one came out, and it got a lot of critical attention in the States, and I was able to sort of travel around a lot with it and do a lot of conventions. And I would say 90% of the people that read the books are from the States, and I think about 50% of those people think that it's Essex County, New Jersey, until I tell them otherwise. That's okay. Yeah, so the books have been great, and like I said, they don't sell tons of copies, but they carry enough prestige, and they garnered enough critical attention that I was able to approach DC Comics, my sort of childhood dream, and propose a couple projects. And now I'm doing 2 books for them, and I was able to quit my kitchen job finally, and I'm a full-time cartoonist. So somehow the impossible sort of happened just by, telling a story about this area and this location. This is the cover for they're doing a collected edition of all 3 Essex County books this summer in one big volume. So the first book, which I proposed to DC, got turned down. It wasn't very good, so I can see why they turned it down. But the second thing I proposed was this. It was called The Nobody. And one of my favorite books growing up was the science fiction novel The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. And I think when I finished the Essex County books, they were obviously really personal stories, and the kind of stories they drew on so much of my own life experiences, and to tell another story like that right away was something I didn't really have in me at the time. I think I need to live a little bit more of my life before I have new stories to tell set in this area, or that are that personal. So I was looking for something new to do. And the other area of Canada where I spent a lot of my childhood was up near North Bay, a little fishing town called Astorville. My parents would take us fishing up there every summer since I was a kid, and they still go up now. And I always loved that area of Ontario as well, just the small fishing towns and fishing for pickerel in the lake with my dad and stuff like that. And it seemed like like with the Essex County stuff, that just seemed like such a rich visual thing for me to explore. So I got the idea of taking the Invisible Man and putting him in Astorville in a tiny motel, and watching the townspeople go crazy when this bandaged weirdo moves into town. So that's The Nobody, and that's going to come out in July as a hardcover from DC. The second project, which is kind of hard to describe, but it's best been described by the DC people as Bambi meets Mad Max. And it's someone in the class today asked me where I got the idea for this, and my idea was I have no idea where I got the idea for it. It's hard to describe, but it's about a little boy with antlers who's lived the first 11 years of his life in sort of wooded seclusion with his father, who's forbid him from ever leaving the woods. And throughout the course of the story, he's obviously forced to leave the woods for the first time, and what he encounters is our world, but through the eyes of a complete innocent who has no frame of reference for anything he's seeing. Again, I couldn't, since it's a DC book, I can't really say it's set in Canada, so I had to say Nebraska, but it's they're really traveling across Essex County for a lot of the book. So that's Sweet Tooth, and that's going to be like a monthly comic book series, which is coming out. I think the first issue is scheduled for September, and it'll be my first book that's in full color as well, which is really exciting. And it's been a real learning experience trying to write a 22-page monthly serial, as opposed to like with the Essex County books and The Nobody and things. They're much sort of like one long story where I can just sort of let the story breathe and take as many pages as I need to to tell what I want to say. Whereas with this, I have to be much more economical in the way I'm using comics to fit everything I want to fit into 22 pages. And for me, as someone who, for those who have read the Essex County books, so much of what I do is just letting the open spaces breathe and let long, silent sequences pass by where you kind of get the sense of time passing in these characters' lives. And when I'm forced to do everything in 22 pages, I can't really do that anymore. So I've been forced to sort of develop a lot of new storytelling techniques. It's kind of a, I guess, Hitchcockian sort of thriller, and it's really different from the Essex County stuff. But like I said, it's hard to just keep doing the same thing over and over without myself losing interest in that, and I think the readers wouldn't want to just keep reading the same story from me all the time. So there was certainly a bit of a conscious effort on my part to do something different with my new books. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, that's all I really had to say, but we can open up to questions now.
Yeah, certainly got lots of questions. So.
When you made the first Tales from the Farm, did you always want to do a trilogy? Or
well, like I said, I think the first book was just a small story that I was going to do, and I think probably near the end of working on that book, new ideas for new characters started to come up that I wanted to tell, and connecting it to that first book and putting them in the same setting just seemed like a good way. I really enjoyed doing the first book, so it's almost like you don't want it to end when you're doing a story like that, and so it was just a way to expand it and sort of stay in that world and continue it. So I think somewhere around the end of working on that first book, I sort of decided to do at least 2 books, and then the third one sort of became necessary after to tie everything together a bit tighter. So it sort of, I guess, grew out of that first book, and probably right near the end of working on it, the idea of the trilogy sort of. It's really interesting because I'm so used to be able to tell a story from beginning to end, and with any kind of monthly comic book, it really depends on sales, how long they'll let the series continue. So I don't know how long it'll last. For all I know, I know from my contract that I'll do at least a year of 12 issues before they decide anything, but it's a really different experience for me to try to plan out a story that's satisfying to me without knowing where the end's going to be. And so basically I know the beginning, and I know what I want the end to be. I just hope that they give me enough notice before they cancel the book that I at least get to tell that last story. And it's just, what's in between the beginning and the end will be either 12 issues, or if I'm lucky, 60 issues, and I'll be doing this for 5 years or something. Yeah, I really had to. The way they do monthly comics like that these days, for people who don't read comics, is they now collect almost every comic book series after 5 or 6 issues into like a graphic novel format to sell it again in bookstores and things. So they really want the story structured in 5 or 6 issue little mini stories within the bigger story. And I had to pretty much plot out. I think I had to plot out like 40 issues for them of what I would do, just loosely, and. So I had to do all that stuff with my initial pitch to them. I think it's going to be the same dimensions as the original books, but where is it? Like I said, it's got like 60 extra pages. I think there's 2 mini comics I did set in Essex County as well, which I just sort of sold at conventions as I was traveling. And I'm going to include those into the book, and I think there's about 30 or 40 pages of stuff from my sketchbooks and some of my early character designs and things for the characters, which will all be in it. So I think it's like 512 pages, a hardcover book. So it's great. It's going to be great to see it all together. No, not really. I think if anything, my art's gotten more detailed and a little more realistic since I started doing the monthly book, which actually takes longer, but I'm still fairly fast in terms of what they're used to, so I haven't had a lot of problems meeting a deadline or anything yet. But my artwork's really changed quite a bit even from the Essex County and the Nobody on this new series. It's just natural. You're always just learning new things and getting better, but I think my stuff looks quite different now than it did, even 2 years ago. People always ask ask me why my books are so sad. I have no idea, because I'm not really a sad person. Adam was asking me earlier what the sort of the tones of my books being so sort of lonely and sad, and I don't know. I've always been a guy who enjoyed sad music more than pop music. I just, for whatever reason, that stuff just makes me feel more, and it seems to me that's just a much easier way to reveal the best in people is to put them through really hard times, and so my stories tend to put the character through a lot of hell. But they usually, I think the best aspects of those people end up coming through, hopefully, at some point in the stories as a result. And I think that's the reason why the new book tends to be, it's pretty violent compared to some of my earlier stuff, and there's a lot more action and things like that. But I'm trying not to just do it for the sake of doing it. To me, the action and the violence that I'm using, it's just another way for me to sort of up the emotional stakes of these characters and sort of hopefully reveal what's good about people and what's good about their friendship with the two main characters and things like that. And to me, my drawing style tends to be pretty stark and my line's pretty jagged, and so that lonely Essex County landscape seemed to really match with that. To me, it's such a landscape that it's just a perfect landscape to set those sort of lonely emotional stories. So, yeah, again, it's not really a conscious thing. That just seems to be the stories I'm drawn to, and I like to tell. Maybe someday I'll do a comedy, but I don't see it happening. I'm a big David Lynch fan, and that's a huge influence. Twin Peaks is a big influence on The Nobody. I like all the greats like Scorsese. And yeah, I don't know. I specifically on these books, particularly, I can't really think of many film directors that really influenced I'm sure. All of us grow up now seeing so much TV and movies. I'm sure that influenced my storytelling style in a lot of ways I don't even realize, but not consciously anyway.
Okay.
I've been lucky so far that even with working with DC and stuff, they sort of hired me based on my other work, so they kind of knew the kind of stories I like to tell, and that's what they wanted me to do. So I haven't had any sort of restrictions put on me yet in terms of how I can tell a story or the kind of stories that I want to tell. And if I was working on I mentioned the Dale's class earlier, if you were working on maybe an established character like Batman or Superman or something, they have a lot more ownership over that, and they're a lot more careful about what's done with those characters and what the writers do and things. And the editors would probably be a lot stricter with me if I was working with an established character, but since they're my own creations, and they've pretty much been open just to let me do my thing as long as I meet my deadlines, and yeah, I haven't had any trouble. Yeah, so. There's been so many Batman comics, it's like, what do you do, with the character? I could have Batman come to the farm and hang out with my parents or something. I don't know. I'd love to do some superhero stuff one day, but like I said to the class earlier, it would really have to be, they'd really have to let me do it my way, and you know what I mean? So unless I could do it in my own terms, I don't know that I'd really be interested in doing anything like that. But there's always a part of you, the kid that grew up reading that stuff, you'd love to see your name on one of those books, one day. So if I ever had the chance, I'm sure it'd be hard to pass up. No, that's really hard. There's some movie people working on the Tales from the Farm stuff right now, and they had a guy write a screenplay based on the first graphic novel, and they sent it to me to read, and I could only read about 10 or 15 pages, and it just was devastating. I could not comprehend some stranger writing like Jimmy LaBeouf and Lester. It drove me nuts, and I can't handle it. They're such a part of me. Each one of those characters is really just sort of one little bit of my personality, or my, I can't let anyone else do that. It's just too personal. I think probably when I was working on Tales from the Farm, I was listening to one of her albums a lot, and she has a song called, I can't remember what it's called now. I Wish I Was the Moon, and it was about just a song about an old man sitting in a chair and sort of looking back on his life and, wishing he was the moon and he could see down. And yeah, whatever. But that was really the little spark for a lot of the character of Lou in Ghost Stories. And I've told my mom before that character comes from a few places. I had an uncle who was deaf, and he was in a nursing home right around the time I was working on Tales from the Farm. And my mom had told me a few stories of her visiting him, and some of those stories worked themselves directly into his character. And it just seemed the Tales from the Farm was a book really about a boy's imagination and about how he would escape into his imagination to sort of escape his circumstances. And when I was working on the second book, and my mom was telling me these stories, you think of the flip side of that would be an old man who no longer has anything to look forward to and doesn't have anything to imagine anymore. So where does he escape? And that would be to escape into his past, into his memories, much in the same way a little boy would escape into his imagination. And those two characters sort of became, flip sides of a coin or whatever. And her song, those lyrics actually work themselves into the story, where there's a point where he's remembering us, as an old man, he's remembering an incident that happened to him when he's in his 20s, and his old man face, becomes the moon watching his younger self doing this. And so that's where that song worked itself.
So, and what you just said about the Lester character from the first book and Lou from the second, is that why they meet at one point in the second
Of course,
book?
and they're both wearing the same plaid jacket. If you notice. Yeah, they meet he's running away from the nursing home, and the little boy's running away from home, and they meet each other on a dirt road, and they're both wearing the same plaid jacket. And they kind of have the same personality and just wish each other well on their way and keep going. Yeah. So. For me, I feel like so many stories, so many movies, so many comics and stuff are all set in like the big city, like New York, or you know what I mean. There's just so much that there's not enough people writing stories about rural life, and also it's a lot easier to draw. Ghost Stories, a lot of it is about the contrast of one brother living in the city and one brother living in the country, and the two paths their lives take. And I was sort of my experiences of living in Toronto at the time, but coming from here, and I sort of, those two, like I think I said to the class earlier, those two aspects of my personality became two different characters almost. And, but to set something specifically in a city, for whatever reason, I just would much rather draw rural landscapes and things. It just seems, like I said, there's just so much stuff set in the city these days. It's nice to see another perspective, especially, even Sweet Tooth, which is like full of action and adventure stuff. I don't think at this point I don't have any of the story planned for a city. It's all like in the backwoods and, like I said, Nebraska, which is really Essex County. Yeah, that right now I'm still really drawn to that landscape for whatever reason. I think it's the same kind of thing as like when I was living on the farm, I didn't have much interest in the place, and now I'm living in the city, so it's like you long for something else that you don't have. It's always, the grass is always greener somewhere. I'm sure if I was living here, I probably wouldn't be telling these stories. I think like the norm for a good comic creator, well, generally like they have DC and Marvel comics are generally almost like an assembly line style. We'll have one person writing, one person doing the pencils, one person inking, one person coloring. Whereas I'm writing, inking, and penciling all myself, so I'm able to take a few shortcuts that maybe if I was writing for someone else, I'd have to spend a little bit more time in my script explaining what I wanted things to look like. Whereas I can I can make shortcuts because I know what I'm imagining as I'm writing it, obviously. But I think like the norm for a penciler or an inker would be if you could do a page a day, that would be good. Because it's to do 22 pages a month, and it gives you time to do a monthly book. But I can generally do, 3 or 4 pages a day sometimes. So and as soon as the editors at DC saw how fast I was working on Nobody, I became one of their favorites like right away. It really helped me get another project with them. Yeah, I did. I was asked if I would ever consider drawing something that someone else wrote, or vice versa. And I've only had one small experience, I told Dale, where I did a 10-page Western story that's going to come up in a little anthology this year that someone else wrote. And I found it really difficult because I'm so used to working. I'll write a script, and then if I want to change something while I'm drawing it, I'm free to change it. I don't have to, run it by anybody. Whereas I really stick to what he wanted, and I just found it really difficult. It was so strict, and I really hated it. I think I'd have a much easier time writing something for someone else to draw than what I did. Yeah, but if it was a writer who I really respected and stuff, I'm sure I'd do it. If I'm doing it, working for, making a living doing comics and being able to wake up every day and do what I love as my job that was my dream. So as long as it lasts, I'm happy. You know, if I have to go back to restaurants in 2 years, at least I'll have lived my dreams. You know, it's funny when you get to that point where you can wake up every day and do the thing you love, and then you have some days where you just don't feel like doing it, you know, and you have to remind yourself that you could be doing something you hate. And I guess being a professional as opposed to being what I was before was doing the thing that I love to do, even the days I don't feel like doing it. But yeah, my dream was always to work for DC Comics. So it's you know, happened. My editor at DC is the editor of a lot of the books I loved growing up, and working with him, and it was just really like a thrill, and yeah, it's been great. So. The kinds of comics I don't like are comics that you can, with so many graphic novels being turned into films now, when you go to comic conventions and stuff, you see all these upstart small publishers who they're clearly just publishing stuff as a way of trying to get a movie made, and the result is comics that are really usually pretty bad, like some high concept thing, like vampires meets, you know, aliens meets, you know, something really stupid that they think they can sell as a movie, and it leads just to really bad comics, because it's people doing comics not because they love them and they want to make good comics. They're doing it for a totally different reason, so that's really annoying. And I think the other thing, which I spoke a lot about in class, is a lot of like superhero comics today, the artists rely so heavily on a photo reference, and they base characters on actors and things, and they just seem to be trying so hard to make comics look like movies or look like TV shows, when comics themselves can be so wonderful and creative and have their own language that it just seems counterproductive to me. I mean, it's such an individual thing from page to page if you're looking at a comic, but I mean, comics can do things like you can jump between 2 or 3 time periods within one page. And you can, in ways that in a movie you couldn't without, because movies are so linear in the way that you go. The other thing you can do with comics is like, Dale talked about, I do a lot of things where I repeat images or symbolism a lot, like later on in a story in a different context. And the great thing about a comic is you can easily flip back to like an earlier page or an earlier sequence instantly, whereas in a movie you can't. You have to like rewind it and find the scene again. But for me, I think I mentioned this before, comics are so much more like editing a movie than shooting or directing a movie, whereas it's more of what you leave out in a comic that's really tells the story. It's like you just try to find the one image or the one moment that communicates what you're trying to say. And I think comics, that's the strength of comics, is sort of that simplicity and that directness, which film for me doesn't seem to have in the same way. And you're just free. Film is always one ratio, like the image is always the same thing, whereas you can turn a comics page and you can have one panel that's like this big with 4 tiny panels that say something in the way that they're laid out, and the next page can be, you know, a grid of 9 panels. And it's just, you're so free from page to page to communicate that idea in so many different ways, just in the way that you lay out a page. Whereas with a movie, it's always one standard box, really. So it just seems limitless to your imagination, really, and how you can play with that.